When it was completed, the great central hall of the Dublin Pavilion building was praised as the finest apartment ever erected. No small claim, only 2 years after the great exhibition of 1851 at Hyde Park, and reflecting something of the giddy enthusiasm surrounding its construction, and diminished somewhat perhaps by clearly having been written by someone in the inner circle of the Royal Dublin Society. In fact, if we want to know what Dubliners really thought of the Dublin Pavilion, we need look no further than C.P. Rooney's comments on the New York Pavilion, which had been erected in the same year for their exhibition in that city. A key figure in arranging the Dublin exhibition, Rooney was sent across the Atlantic in September of 1853 at what must have been considerable expense. Luckily, this investment was not in vain, for he was able to report, quote, "Notwithstanding all the boasting and vain glorying of the Americans, it is a comparative failure. There was not a single grand effect produced on the mind of the spectator, either at his entry or at any other time." So this clearly reflects the degree of national pride and competitiveness that was so much a part of this exhibition fever that gripped Britain and Ireland during the 1850s. And of course, it was built, the Dublin Pavilion was built under the long shadow of the Crystal Palace in London. At first glance, the Dublin Pavilion building may seem as if it's another great iron and glass structure, but in fact, the main material was timber, iron and glass only in a supporting role. The Era magazine praised its architect John Benson for forgetting the Crystal Palace and having, quote, "the courage to think for himself." The use of wood was defended as assuredly the best that could be employed due to its ease of use, its low cost, and its potential for reuse. And recycling the materials was critical from the point of view of Dargan, who had stipulated that he would take back the value of the materials after the exhibition was over. As we've already heard from Cora, organisation proceeded at a frenzied pace. Dargan's financial offer of £20,000, dated the 24th of June 1852, specified that the exhibition should open no later than June 1853. And this was clearly not seen as sufficiently narrow a frame of time, perhaps in competition with the London exhibition, because the date was later brought forward, of course, to the first week of May. The tender was posted in the press on July 5th for a structure of between 100 and 140,000 square feet at a cost of no more than £15,000. The closing date was only 3 weeks later. But by 12th of August 1852, Benson, who was a Sligo native, had won the competition, beating established names, or what were to become established names, such as Dean Woodward, William Barr, and Richard Turner. And already by the 18th of August, the building's outline was being staked out on Leinster Lawn, and by the 10th of September, 3 of the roof ribs of the southern hall were already in place, and a week later, the first great rib of the main hall was begun. At 147,000 square feet, Benson had designed the building at the larger end of the advertised scale. Then a little-known county surveyor of Cork East Riding, an engineer to the Cork Harbour Commissioners, he had assisted Sir Thomas Deane in the design of the Cork Exhibition building for 1852, in particular the Fine Arts Hall, which was the major kind of innovation of that exhibition. So he would have understood the spatial requirements relatively well and would have been in a kind of an exhibition frame of mind. It may also be relevant that he had studied in the RDS drawing schools early on in his training. So he may have been seen as one of the RDS's own to some degree. He brought in the otherwise unknown engineer Charles Atkins of Cork. We know almost nothing about Atkins. If anybody here knows, be interested to hear what you have to say about him. But he's referred to as helping Benson in the design of machinery that was required to erect the building. So the real challenge was erecting these giant ribs, and you can see here in these two drawings, one of them which is from one of the early Victorian kind of authoritative books on the subject of the exhibition, and then this second drawing is by Gary Lyons, who's recently done an engineering study on some of the exhibition buildings. Very well worth a look if anybody is interested. And you can see here the girdered bay, aisle, and gallery, which was part of the buttressing system to support those great arches. Rooney and Dean's success in persuading British and continental exhibitors saw the plans for the building expand, with Dargan having to contribute a further £6,000 for the Fine Arts and Machinery Hall on the south and north sides of the building, and then a further £14,000 for extra ancillary buildings around Leinster House. And you can see in this aerial view on the left-hand side from the National Library the way in which the buildings really filled up the entire space on both the east and west sides of Leinster House as the need for accommodation continued to expand. In September of 1853, the Illustrated London News itemised the cost of construction and came up at that point with a figure of £47,000, already more than triple the original budget. And in the final reckoning, Dargan, according to one source at least, contributed some £80,000 to the enterprise as a whole. But I think, as we'll see as the day goes on, that there's various figures swimming around as to exactly how much he did pay. Irwin's Dublin Descriptive Guide that year claimed that with all the various additions to the building, quote, counter space would form a continuous line of more than 6 miles in length, and the wall space is equivalent to 5 miles of shop windows without any interval. Quite a contrast to the Ireland that had been described in such harrowing terms within such recent memory. When complete, the building itself was hailed by one reviewer as perhaps the most successful novelty exhibited, both in art and manufacture, which was no bad thing, given that when the exhibition opened on the 12th of May 1853, with some 10,000 people present, many of the exhibits were still in packing cases, while the construction of the ancillary wings was still very much incomplete. Perhaps that was for the best, because later on, one writer, in praising the Grand Hall, complained that its effect was, quote, very much interfered with by the exhibits themselves. The visitor had to go up to the gallery to get an uninhibited view, but by doing so was, quote, necessarily so greatly elevated that his eye lost much of the immense size of the room and much, too, of the charm of its proportions. One can only feel for poor Benson if he was to overhear these comments as he wandered around the exhibition. But the impression of the interior of the Great Hall was regarded favourably by some sources. The Civil Engineer and Architects Journal thought it superior to the Crystal Palace, with, quote, arches appearing within arches, diminished by distance, rather than the straight girders and ridgy roofs of Hyde Park. Now, Gary Lyons, who I mentioned earlier, has explored the engineering of the building in his recent book on the Irish Industrial Exhibition, so I won't go into too much detail on that aspect here, except to make a few comments. As Gary has noted, the key influence on the building was, of course, Paxton's Crystal Palace, the most obvious starting point being the modular regularity of its construction, and most notably, its barrel-vaulted transept and trellis-girdered galleries. Indeed, Benson had already experimented with a variation on a barrel-vaulted space in his southern extension to the Corn Market, and as we saw from the illustration that Cora put up, also had a semi-hemisphere end to it as well. Perhaps equally influential, albeit in somewhat different materials, were the curved iron and glass greenhouses of J.C. Loudon in the second decade of the 19th century. Developed later by Decimus Burton and Richard Turner at the Botanic Gardens at Kew, Belfast and Dublin, and also Charles Lanyon's curvilinear palm house in the Botanic Gardens, Belfast, the central dome of which was constructed around 1852, can't be exactly sure of the date, whether it was 1852 or into 1853, by Young of Edinburgh, who was the same iron firm, foundry, as did the Dublin exhibition. And of course, it contains the salient feature of the Dublin pavilion, which is the extended dome. And it may have been in recognition of Lanyon's influence on the building that Benson consulted him on the treatment of the interior. Benson's most commented upon feature was his use of giant double laminated ribs, which allowed him to dispense with the diagonal cross struts used at the Crystal Palace, which you can see in the illustration on the right. Now, laminated timber ribs had a long history in construction, going back to Philibert Delorme in 16th century France. And Paxton and Burton had placed them on cast iron columns in the Chatsworth glass house, the Great Stove, in the 1830s. And the technique reappears in the transept of the Crystal Palace. And indeed, Lewis Cubitt had used laminated wooden arches in King's Cross Station as recently as 1851-52. And Benson himself had used the technique in his Cork exhibition pavilion. But according to the edited volume by Sproul, John Sproul, which appeared in 1854 on the Dublin exhibition, Benson was to employ laminated timber in a radically different way in Dublin. Technical details for the building's 14 giant 9-ton compound ribs were published in the first edition of the weekly newspaper, the Exhibition Expositor, in 1853, and again in Sproul's volume. The latter argued that, quote, on no former occasion had a roof been constructed whose strength consisted wholly of the inflexibility of the timber arches in the direction of the radius, the lamination being in planes parallel to the base and not in concentric rings. Now, as far as I can tell, this claim is false, as the Crystal Palace ribs comprise 3 vertical timber laminates, as evidenced by the cross-section published by Matthew Digby Wyatt in his 1852 account of its construction. And indeed, Sidney Smirke had also used vertical laminates in the Pantheon Bazaar on Oxford Street in 1834. Their use in bridges had been pioneered in France and Germany in the first 2 decades of the century and became popular with the advent of the railways in Britain in 1830s and 40s. So it may be that there is an attempt in thinking and writing about the exhibition building to find an angle of innovation that could compare in some way with the clearly very innovative use of glass in London, and the fact that the Dublin pavilion was not a Crystal Palace in any meaningful way meant that there had to be some interesting angle on the use of timber. But again, there's question marks over all of this, and I'll be very interested to hear what other people have to say about it. The ribs were cut to uneven lengths, close to 10 feet long, again similar to the approach in the Crystal Palace, and they were joined by staggering the joints to prevent points of weakness running through the ribs. And the inner sides of the planks were left rough to give them a more adhesive quality. There was no glue used, everything was nailed together. And this is just an attempt to try and reimagine what some of these details would have looked like from the very few drawings we have, and indeed from the written accounts. But again, there's question marks. You can see on the left-hand side, there's an iron plate running right through one of the struts, and this was an innovation of the time. And in fact, Dean Woodward used it in the museum building, the idea of reinforcing timber joists in some cases with iron, so you have this kind of combination of materials. Another question is whether they steam bent the timber or whether they cut it into shape. I've had a discussion with Gary Lyons on this, and he thinks that they probably steam bent it so that they would get the advantage of the grain running directly from one piece to the other. I'm not sure whether that would have been necessary or whether these are vastly over-engineered ribs. But again, somebody might have a view on that. There's no reference to the timbers being steam bent, so they may just have been cut. So that's, again, something we need to explore a bit further. Remarkably, unlike for the 1851 exhibition, there don't seem to be any illustrations of the building under construction. If anybody's aware of any, again, I'd be very interested to know. I certainly haven't encountered any. I don't think Cora has encountered any in her research either. We know that except for the quadrant ribs at each end, the building was designed so that it could be erected without scaffolding. So each bay was designed to serve as a support for that next to it. Charles Atkins, who was the engineer, created cranes that ran along the aisles on top of the iron girders and helped erect the ribs. The big problem, of course, was that the ribs, these giant 9-ton ribs, were designed to support themselves when they're upright. But when they're on the ground, lying down, they're not able to support themselves. It took them a week to figure out how to get the first rib up by various reinforcements. The second rib they got up in 20 minutes. So it just shows, this process of thinking on their feet and figuring it out as they went. It was quite extraordinary. The rest of the covering of the building was covered with an outer layer of canvas steeped in tar, a little bit reminiscent of a currach. One wonders whether they were influenced or inspired by that. And then the outside was lime washed. In terms of the exterior, there was general regret that so much of the building was hidden from view. And when you think of those incredible perspectives of the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, what a stunning sight, and the scale of it. We don't get that in Dublin because it was built into such a cramped site, which is a real pity. But Benson was credited with having introduced a variety in the massing while retaining a sense of the building's formal regularity on plan. One of the interesting things about the building is that it's not in any immediately identifiable style. And of course, this is something you could say about the Crystal Palace as well, that these are kind of new directions in architecture. But of course, the kind of Victorian sensibility required some kind of way of making sense of it. And some of the writers suggested that the dome, had hints of a Turkish or Saracenic structure, and that if only the architect had a bit more money, he may have been able to actually do something interesting with that. In fact, it's interesting to see the kind of cross currents of influence in Dublin at the time are actually moving in that direction, because at the exact same time that the exhibition building is going up, 1853, the museum building in Trinity is started, and of course has this incredibly kind of advanced and interesting new direction in architecture inspired by Islamic precedent. And in fact, Benson and Dargan were both involved in the evolution of a purely Irish thing in the Victorian period, which was the Turkish bathhouse. And it comes out of Ireland and it spreads across Britain and then Europe. But it comes from a stone's throw away from where the exhibition building was in Lincoln Place. And Benson is thought to have been involved with that and with Dargan's Turkish baths in Bray. And this is 1859, 1860, and very, very close to what's going on. So you can just see how all this is emerging. And of course, the colour palette of the interior is inspired by Owen Jones's colour palette in Crystal Palace. And Jones, as we heard yesterday evening, was responsible for those great chromolithographic volumes on the Alhambra. And not only are they interesting for kind of channeling Islamic architecture into Western Europe, but they're in colour, and they're the first major architectural volumes in colour. So Jones is not just creating the colour palette for these exhibitions, he's creating colour itself for the Victorian period. He's communicating colour for the first time. And you can see that in the museum building as well, this interest in structural polychromy, and that is what's picked up in the pavilion itself, in timber. Lastly, I just want to mention the roof and the light, because the light was a very important part of the conversation around the pavilion, because it was thought as it was going up that it was going to be too dark, and everybody was quite concerned and nervous about what it was going to be like inside once it was finished. And there were a few critical comments, but the argument was made that Benson was very conscious about the light and how much light he was letting into the building, and it was to do with the fact that the Crystal Palace had been flooded with light. There was way too much light, and the goods that were on display for many months at a time were being affected by this constant sunshine. In fact, what they did here at the Dublin exhibition building was they introduced ribbed, fluted glass so that they wouldn't have direct rays hitting the objects on display. And in fact, this is, I think, one of the great legacies of the Dublin pavilion, is that it is the connecting tissue between the Crystal Palace in 1851 and the Art Treasures exhibition in Manchester, which follows from the Dublin exhibition building. This is some work I've been doing with Philip, who's been researching George Scharf's hang at the great Art Treasures exhibition in 1857. And of course, another connecting part of that is the fact that John Conlon Dean, who's arranging the art in Dublin, is also the initiator of this exhibition. So Dublin, I think the idea, the pavilion, the top-lit, arcaded, barrel-vaulted galleries are translated over into the Manchester exhibition, I think, very successfully. So I'm going to leave it there, but I just want to finish by thanking Cora McDonough for her assistance with various materials, and also Aoife Marie Buckley for very kindly sharing some of her research, and Gary Lyons as well, who very kindly chatted with me about the exhibition building and shared one of those fine drawings of the building. So thank you very much.